Not surprisingly, there was an absolute consensus that data sharing and research collaboration is critical. That theme popped up throughout all the presentations and all the discussion. Really briefly, I'm going to go over the introductions. Madalena Biarci from the Ocean Conservation Society talked about her study of bottlenose dolphins in the Santa Monica Bay, and she stressed that she's already collaborating with groups doing similar work from Baja to Monterey Bay, and that's a very important component of her research. John C. Talked about Cascadia's photo ID work. It relies heavily on collaboration and contributions from the public, and he mentioned the Splash project, which is the largest collaboration ever with over 400 participants, and he showed us the website that is going to be launching pretty soon with all of the data. He also mentioned that to the public it seems natural for scientists to collaborate, but there are powerful forces against collaboration, like competition for funding and first publication rights and sometimes egos. So he brought up another theme that popped up throughout, which is to address issues up front. There should always be communication, and pitfalls and parameters should really be discussed as much as possible. Jim Regetz of NCs talked about his actually he called his work an informatics mission. He wants to create a platform to use existing data to answer bigger questions than individual research questions. And he's building a community data and metadata network. And he's working on creating a scientific workflow from data to analysis. Melissa Soldevilla from Ovis CMAP talked about the open access database that she managed, which she calls a database of all marine megafauna information. The aim is to bring all data together in one place, and she talked about providing incentives to data providers, and she also addressed concerns about access to data. And the issue came up of letting the data providers know when their data is accessed and by who. Elisa Schoen-Janiger talked about her gray whale census, which uses highly trained volunteer observers. She has a large group of volunteers. The census is in its 31st year, and she contrasted that with the California Killer Whale catalog, which she curates, where she really has to solicit contributions from people that probably previously had absolutely no exposure to any scientific work. And so some of the topics that came up during the discussion: who should be able to access databases? An example was brought up: should Japanese whaling scientists be allowed to access to the Antarctic Humpback catalog? The issue of Navy funding research came up. The consensus was that the Navy has is doing a lot better than just a while ago. Dave Waller called it an open science policy. There's a lot of progress, although there's still some people think that if the research money were funneled through an independent body, that would be better. And Sean Hanser pointed out that the Navy is reviewing its policy on research, and there's a lot of opportunity right now to have influence on that decision. Collaboration in technology was brought up, but John C. pointed out that it's easier to resolve technology issues than methodology, that it's really important that the methodology be uniform. And so again, that goes back to the theme of communication. The users of the data should be in contact with the researchers who collected the data to make sure that all the parameters and methodologies are understood. John warned against collecting data just for the sake of a database, that the interpretation of the data is critical. So there, while we emphasize databases and sharing, it's still the individual scientists still play a critical role. And we ended up with 4 regional priorities. That was kind of what we set out to do. 4 projects or goals. As Dave pointed out in his introduction yesterday, it will forever be known as Priority X, a shared bottlenose catalog for Southern California and Northern Baja. And that is really the consensus was that is a great candidate. It's the points that were brought up. We should agree on priorities, formalized objectives. Should be an open access database, and we would identify projects that are ripe for collaboration, and we also identify trends in the research. And it's something that could be done incrementally. Start with inputting historic data, and from there branch out to other kind of data. The second one was a great short-footed database of who is doing what, and that's basically a database of you guys, us here in the room, contact information, research interests, papers, a place where you can see who else is working, what you're working on, who's doing something that you might be interested in. And that really was very well received. I've been told that the technology workshop came up with a similar idea, and I mean that is something that really might gain some traction. The third suggestion was a orca sightings network, similar to the one that exists in Puget Sound. And John pointed out that it's having a sighting network is a great way to not just to disseminate the information, but also to incentivize people to contribute. The fact that the contributors' names get out there in real time has greatly improved contributions up in Puget Sound. And finally, Sean suggested I have it down as better understanding of gray whales. So I mean, not necessarily a database, but an effort to close our gaps in knowledge about gray whales, which are also a species of great interest in this area. And that's kind of what I have. I don't know, Dave, if you want to add anything.
No, just to say thank you for tackling that job.
I just wanted to say I think that part of the study of gray whales was specifically route choices and abundance at timing of abundances, so that it would be helpful certainly for Navy and other vessels to know where these animals are at a specific time.
Well, there you go.
Bernard, I wasn't in the group, but if I was going to make it public that I have a sperm whale photo ID catalog of flukes from California out to Hawaii, and I'll provide anybody copies with that who wants to see it. If you want to contribute to it, I'd be happy to do the matching as well.
I think that probably falls somewhat on our number two. You know, who's doing what that should maybe not just refer to individuals, but to projects and efforts like that. I mean, it should be a place. Yeah, somebody who gets a photo ID, or you know. Greg and Dave are doing offshore Jersey jobs, and Grampus. I mean, what else? They're not just IDs, but also certain observations are going to be of interest to somebody somewhere. So it's a matter of matching that up, finding the right person. There are no more questions. Thank you.
I'm going to do the wrap up for the session on environment and human impact. Now we've got up here the sort of table that we're not supposed to put up in a venue like this, but in our discussion we decided that it would be very important to lay out the risks systematically. We had people who discussed quite a few of these during the course of the session. Pete Maria talked about contaminants and biotoxins. Dr. St. Ledger talked about diseases and parasites and the kinds of things that you discover in stranded animals when you're a pathologist. I talked about the impact of noise and human disturbance. And Sarah Wilkin talked about strandings and patterns in strandings. But in the course of the discussion, it became clear that there were gaps that we had not really identified in the course of doing this, and also that we hadn't really talked about, are some of these gaps things where we just plain don't know how much of a risk it is, or are some of these things where we have a pretty good idea that it's a risk and it's an important factor in population? So that's what this table is about. And I think the end product is something that's going to go to Sarah Kowalski to put into the summary, so you don't need to go through every one of them, but I want to talk a little bit, wrap up kind of the discussion about, okay, how important are some of these and what are the action items that we would recommend as an outgrowth of having identified these possible risk factors. So we may come back to this in the course of the discussion. A couple of important things. Do I have a pointer here? One is that this column here represents what do we really know. If it's an unknown, like we really don't know what the impact of oil spills on marine mammal health and welfare and populations is going to be, then that's clearly something that we need to put some effort into figuring out. We don't know population level effects for a lot of these. Some of these we do. We don't know whether there's a significant anthropogenic component. And then we put this down here whether or not the panel discussed it, because there were some topics that we just plain didn't get to and probably deserve a bit more attention in the future. Okay, so these are the risk factors. Of these, I don't think any of them really need a whole lot of explanation, with the possible exception of intraspecific social competition. We discussed it several times yesterday in different contexts. What this means is that, you know, these marine mammals are not just little black boxes knocking around at random in the world. They also have relationships to one another. And if there's competitive exclusion going on, that's going to change our decision about how to manage them and possibly their susceptibility to human influences. So that went on the list. And then, of course, those of us who grew up in the era of the exclusive and exhaustive hypothesis, we don't know that we can come up with an exhaustive list for anything as complicated as the Southern California area. Okay, so disease concerns. Historically, people have treated disease, you know, marine mammal, they all look great. Why do we need to worry about disease? Well, it turns out that of course, they're like us and like terrestrial animals, they have diseases, and these can have significant effects. So the action items that we identified in the course of Dr. St. Ledger's talk on disease and also the discussion is we need to improve the evaluation of stranding data. People are collecting it, but they're not necessarily pulling it together and putting it into a useful form, and this sounds like an echo of the discussion that we just had. Improved monitoring of strandings. We saw in the course of Sarah Wilkins' talk these clusters of, these guys are great at finding strandings. Gosh, they're all dying in Southern California. Well, not necessarily. Maybe the observation effort is simply way better in Southern California, and this is something that the stranding community as a whole needs to get a grip on. Improve disease epidemiology so that we can talk about it, you know, at a population level, and integration of disease concerns with other potential impacts because there may be unexpected or synergistic factors that we're not even considering. Biotoxins, we spent quite a bit of time discussing this. We need to understand the factors promoting algal blooms that produce, for example, domoic acid poisoning. And also have a look at runoff. Dr. St. Ledger did a great job of talking about how, yeah, land to sea, so runoff may be producing these effects, but we don't necessarily always know that it isn't something that's already going on in the animals that are at sea. So we need to get the details. We need to get the devil in the details. If this turns out to be important, then obviously the action is to talk about reducing runoff. But we need to know that it's worth the effort and the expense and everything else that's going to go into doing that. Derelict fishing gear, this is a no-brainer, and I think even though it wasn't really a topic of specific discussion during the panel, many people came up to me afterwards and said, look, this is my big concern, is that fisheries interactions are a big deal for these guys. It's a no-brainer. We know it's a problem, so let's do something about that. Now, John Hildebrand made an impassioned plea at the end of our session saying, look, we need to get the word out, we need to get action now, we can't wait around with this kind of thing. At the time, he was thinking about the data that Keith presented, telling us that California sea lions and the Southern California bite have 10 times the levels of PBDEs that other marine mammals in the state. Those of us who were raised during the 1960s go, oh, I had pollutions, contaminants, this is terrible, obviously it's a problem. But we don't really know that for marine mammals. With fishing gear and interactions with fisheries, we know that this is a problem. We know that this is something that can do whole populations in. So this is something where getting the word out, I think, is really, really important. And funding expanded and continuing actions to actually get this stuff in is an easy no-brainer, let's do it tomorrow kind of a thing. Okay, contaminants. I don't want to repeat what I've just said. A lot of these are points. One big thing is the issue of doing this broad contaminant screen using available more modern techniques like mass spectrometry. Can come up with a whole lot of potential contaminants, but then we have to figure out which one of them are important and which are not. We need more diverse information about species that haven't been screened as yet, because what we're looking at mostly is the small population, the small subset of species that tend to come ashore. We need to do some work to look at historical information that we can pull out of sediments and other sources of historical information, which may give us a timeline and a trend, and also evaluate where the animals may be getting exposed to these things, and then look at tissue levels relative to what actually happens to the animal. Noise, that was a discussion that I had. My big pitch was, please, we need to evaluate cumulative exposure to noise. Everything that we know about people says that most of the time it isn't the one gun going off in your ear that makes you go deaf. It's lifetime exposure to noise, exposure to high intensity sources over long periods. And this is something that we know has both physiological as well as auditory effects. We know it also has behavioral effects. So let's get the technology together and focus on trying to get better long-term epidemiological or long-term individual information, so that we can actually start addressing those questions that we think are important, as opposed to just kind of making up these big catastrophic things about one source in one location over one short period of time. The other thing is that in several of the sessions, our session yesterday and also today in the session on new technology, we talked about how behavior in the sense that a behavioral ecologist means is something that we're not very good at measuring in marine mammals, because we don't get to see them doing anything for more than a few seconds at a time while they're at the surface, or for a few seconds when you swim after them with a camera. We really need to start finding ways of getting this long-term data, and I think acoustics provides us with one of the most important tools for that purpose. Okay, changing climate and conditions, education and outreach. This is one of the areas where we can use the kind of cult of marine mammals as a way of getting across the point about how important this is without throwing political buzzwords in people's faces. So I think this is something both so that they can understand the complexity and unexpected differences in trends from one location to another that they're going to be encountering. What do you mean it's getting colder here? For heaven's sakes, if you're frozen all winter long, obviously there's no global warming, you know, that kind of mentality. And also help them to understand that if we're going to keep track of the kind of climate change that we expect, everybody's going to need to help with the monitoring. This can't just be a few scientists trying to cover the entirety of the Southern California area. We need citizen support to help us find out what's going on. So that's what that's about. The other is that as these changes occur, we need to integrate what we know about what's happening with the oceanographic conditions to all of these other potential risk factors, because we expect there to be strong interactions, and there was a discussion that particularly impact on prey species is likely to be very important. So that's something where we need to be doing the monitoring now and going forward in time over the course of the changes we expect. Now, there were big holes in what we discussed. Fisheries bycatch, I think, is the one most often cited as I went around and talked to people last night. We didn't talk about the effects of oil spills. In some ways, you can bury that under the contaminant issue, but remember that there's also exposure to inhaled hydrocarbons. And the fact that they're swimming through this, particularly if you're an animal with hair or fur, there's also the issue of fouling and other possible physical effects. So it's really something that needs to be treated as a special concern. Panel covered ship strikes, so enough said on that. And then finally the issue of these animals may be top-level predators, but they still are exposed to predation. And in this category, I would also include mortality in social conflicts, which we know almost nothing about in marine mammals, but if other social species are anything to be taken as an indicator, it's something we really need to think about. So putting a little bit more emphasis on figuring out ways to document this, I think would be a really great idea. So I think that's it. I thought that Dr. St. Ledger's quadruple environmental tragedy cartoon at the beginning kind of said it all about the topic that we were talking about. We have all of these risk factors, but we expect them to be acting synergistically. And so we need to figure out ways of assessing the potential for injury that way. Okay, so that was a 15-minute version of this. Are there any questions, or Judy, would you like to add anything? Where'd she go?
No, I think that was an excellent sort of presentation. We did, Ed and I talked a little bit, at the end of our session, there was discussion of, can we put all these things we'd like to address into a nice package, to make a vote? And it was brought up, should we apply these actions and tie them all into something like looking at nearshore tertiary as a sort of a cornerstone or a keystone population that we want to evaluate all these other factors in, so we could sort of take a small bite of a big problem, but tie it in for many different factors. And I think we'd like kind of workshop participant thoughts on that, because one of the things that came out of the session was, well, if we picked two cetacean species and a pinniped species, we could maybe deal with some of the contaminant issues, and perhaps we could even deal with some of the prey stock type issues. We could easily delineate populations, ranges, things like that, but it doesn't address all of the many diverse concerns that we had regarding human interaction and environmental impacts. So I think one of the questions we had when you were sort of getting this all together is, what does the workshop think would be the best way to address all of those, the laundry list of things we said needs to be done?
And in a format where we can use it as kind of, this is a template for how the work would go with other species in other areas. I think so. The nearshore versus offshore tertiary seems like a good comparative model that we talked about quite a bit. We also talked about California sea lions, but interestingly enough, focused northern fur seal because they're at the southernmost end of their range here in Southern California. They seem like they'd be particularly sensitive to climate change, especially since their range is pretty restricted in this area. So that's another suggestion of possible model species. We also talked at the end, do we have a misticete model that we could really come up with that might address a bunch of these concerns? And the gray whale's name got bandied around. But the point is, this is something that's going to take some mature contemplation and also probably input from a lot of different people. So that's a quick overview. Anybody else have comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, just one comment. There was a couple bullets on water quality and runoff. And just so the group knows, there's a fair amount of work that's been done and being done on addressing runoff from both the nutrient standpoint for algal blooms and also the contaminants in runoff. So I just would urge the group to either talk to me or seek out some of the people that are doing these research, because it is there. It is not something that this group needs to reinvent or start. I think we're well on the way to answering some of those questions.
And could you go back to your first slide?
Can I go back to my first slide? Can I do that with the tool that I have?
Let's try this.
That one? No.
There we go.
You shouldn't have shown it,
And these were meant to encompass just human-related threats, or some of those are sort of, like I see, predation and disease?
Well, so the question is, we used the Southern Resident Killer Whale Status Review as kind of a template for all the things that people came up with, and then added a couple from the discussion. Predation clearly is something that comes up. The question is this something where our influence, for example, we may respond to climate change ourselves in order to adapt to pressures ourselves in a way that affects what happens to marine mammals. For example, by taking more of their prey or something like that. So the question is, would we have an influence on potential predation on a species? And I don't think we know the answer to that question. So that was why this one got to be an unknown. On the other hand, vessel activity and ship strike, yep, you bet there's an anthropogenic component to that.
Okay. So you guys weren't necessarily, those are on the list even if they're not necessarily anthropogenic. And I'm just sort of thinking and reflecting on, after hearing Barb's lunchtime talk, one of the key tenets was prioritizing I think all of us, and I was guilty of it a year ago when I gave the talk on threats to marine mammals, which was failing to prioritize my list.
Well, that's what this part of the list was for. Do we think it has a population level effect? And I'm not sure that, you know, based on the discussion that we have the ability to sort it by this column.
Right.
That was kind of the
The
discussion.
whole point of it, yeah, that was fair.
So for example, with climate change, yeah, you know, we were expecting it to have a big influence, but we don't really know how to do that now.
I mean, I think it's a challenge, and it was a challenge for me just because different species, I would prioritize different ones of those higher. And I think when we had this discussion before, there was certainty of risk, you know, certainty, uncertainty of risk versus magnitude of risk. You can have some things like climate change, which might have a high, you know, uncertainty of how they'll affect things, but the potential magnitude is huge. You know, you have other things that maybe the risk rather smaller, but they're more certain to know. I didn't know if you guys got into that at all on this, but I got challenged on it a year ago, so I guess.
Well, we should talk about it.
It was you that challenged me.
I'm capable of it.
Well, you know, something that might actually, and I'm just thinking out loud a little bit, part of when Judy made her intro on this, and she said it's kind of being at the end of that, you know, of the pipeline of whatever happens, you know, when the animal ends up in her lab to be checked for what happened. And then saying, I need to know kind of all these things that are upstream from this is an important thing for her. That might actually be, that might help to some degree, at least if we're going to prioritize. If there was something that said, I can figure out X at the end of the pipeline, but some things that just can, absolutely, I've got no idea earlier on in the pipeline, but can be characterized by you, you, and you, or something like that, might be a great way to start out prioritizing, because there might be a way of saying, it might be going for the low-hanging fruit at the same time, but it might be a way of saying, okay, at the end, I can't tell this, so I need you to bring this into focus farther up the line. And so where we've got control of that focus now, it might be a great place to start, because in some other areas like oil spills, we don't really necessarily, we can do preventative work, but right now we don't have really great opportunity to go out and get data during an oil spill. We might say, well, right now I can't change that, but something else can be prioritized that I know I can bring into focus, and at the end isn't able to be tackled at the end of the line.
Hey, can you give us a concrete example of something that might fall into that category?
Well, I think like Judy's.
I can.
Okay,
Okay.
you go for it.
I'm going to throw an East Coast example, but it's really a cute one. So I think many folks in the room know I do a fair bit of work with the biologists in Florida who do stranding work with kogia. And one of the things we know about kogia is about 95% of the adult kogia die from a heart disease. And the young ones don't have it, so certainly it could be an inherited congenital thing that doesn't manifest until the animal is grown up, but we don't know that. So I can tell you that 95% of a population of stranded animals dies from the same disease. But I can't tell you their contaminant load. I can't tell you the impact of contaminants that I can identify in them and their potential contribution to that problem. I can't tell you the genetics of the population that potentially could be contributing to the cardiac disease. I can't tell you what food items they're eating and compare it to other populations to see if the disparity of prey consumption is impacting, you know, their hearts. So I can give you a couple of those concrete examples and say, I need to know about populations, I need to know about what they're eating, I need to know about their contaminants, I need to know how their environmental interactions are working. I don't think I can do it for every particular species, and that goes to some of what John C. talked about earlier. Heck, for these big whales, they don't get to my part of the pipeline. But that's very doable, and there's tons of questions when I get done with some of those cases.
The question I ask myself when I want to focus on what are the biggest risk factors is to actually make it concrete. Which of these factors is likely to reduce any population in Southern California by 50% in the next 15 to 20 years. I think if you put it in those sort of terms, you can quickly throw out some which are really long-term effects that perhaps are subject for long-term studies, but it helps you focus on what are the immediate short-term threats. And I'd really love to poll the entire room to see what spread of perceived threats if there would be if you had to pick a single threat that met that criteria.
Well, maybe that's something we can do on the website for the workshop. Is just give people a chance to rate those things. That might be a pretty simple way of at least getting the top 5.
Some language from risk management might help in this discussion of risk you guys are doing. Risk is usually talked about in terms of as the multiplication of potential for occurrence times the potential consequences. So risk itself gets, the word gets bandied about and used loosely by people, and then people start getting confused. But if you separate those two factors and then do the multiplication, you can generate risk, what we call risk matrix. So you list all your potential things, and then you list out or identify, you know, everybody can perhaps agree on the what the risk of it potentially occurring or the likelihood of occurrence is, and then maybe you can agree on the consequences if that should occur or some particular level of it should occur. And then by multiplying those, you can identify what are in fact the highest risk factors. But if you separate out those two pieces of it, it makes it a lot easier to discuss.
That's a good point. The other thing is that these things, not only are they not exhaustive necessarily, but they're not mutually exclusive. So, for example, climate change and prey availability are quite likely to be integrated. So we'd have to cope with some of that kind of issue and winnow it down to the most independent things we can come up with. Any other comments? Any other contributions from the panel members? Okay, that's us.
Okay, so here are our panelists, and everybody had a chance to give a more expanded discussion of the technologies that they're developing, and and I don't know who's sitting in the audience, but I learned quite a bit from everybody who spoke, and so we broke it down into things that were happening in the laboratory, and then captive animals and then in the field. So Phil talked about, and here's a new word I learned, omics, which I guess is just you take the end off of Judy. Right? This is Dorian's word. And so and when I asked Dorian who used it, and then I said, wait a minute, you got to define that. It's just the ability to acquire data on a large scale. Right? Now, if you have burning questions about this, please point them at Dorian, because you've exhausted my understanding of it. But now here we have genomics, where you're looking at the DNA or RNA. You have proteomics, so basically gene expression of the proteins. Transcriptomics, right? It's definitely got a misspelling. And then metabolics. Metabolomics. Wow. So, but this because this is kind of mind expanding in terms of Phil mostly talked about this, but in all these others, there's going to be this revolution where all of a sudden we'll know a lot more about the origin of all of these things, the details, and we also talked about how basically there's a theme of a spin-off from the technology that's been developed for human studies, and in this case, large-scale sequencing. That how is that going to change, the business that we have in marine mammals? And so one theme with that is that we're going to be inundated, and we already are maybe with data, and that we become, and Phil used the word, it's a biomathematician? You're a biomathematician now.
Bioinformatician.
Bioinformatician. Right. Now see, okay, that's better, because you're extracting information from data, right? But you complained about you spend all your time, fixing your computers or whatever, because, and buying more disks to store the stuff. So, but Phil's particular question was phylogeography and divergence times. But there are probably a whole suite of questions, and so we all need to sort of step back. I mean, once you know enough to be dangerous, thinking about this, then you step back and you say, how can this help what I'm doing right now? And I think it probably does if we think about it. So one thing we didn't do, but we probably should, is thinking about specifically Southern California issues and how all of these, oh my God, how the omics are going to help us answer these issues. And so that might come back even to sorting out some of the things, and I have to think about this, that Anna had on her chart, right? This big matrix of, kind of what all the impacts are. And maybe, this, I'm sure that there are ways of, there are helpful things mixed in here. So, okay. So then Nick had this thing about biopsies, and I used the word, this wasn't Nick's word, but I'll use the word assay, and Dorian said it was okay, so I guess it's okay. Yeah, I don't know, you say it's okay? It's an assay, right? Okay. So, and the biopsies are really the primary way we have of obtaining a sample right now. And so, and there's this precious thing, and so we need to get as much out of it as we can. And Nick's work is really focused on hormones, especially for reproductive potential, but they're, it can dribble into other stressors. And in the SoCal, when we asked Nick, okay, what's the SoCal example? He brought up sonar as a stressor. But the same way we could say ship noise, or we could say toxics, or all these sort of things. So then I stole Nick's slide, and amazingly, Nick told us that he made this slide back as a graduate student, which, if I were your advisor, I would be worried about you. Right? Because, I mean, it's really great because you're thinking, sort of globally, but you've got to muck around right here, to get your PhD, right? But this is great that you were thinking on that sort of level, because you're saying, okay, once we've got this, we can do the genomics, we can do the proteomics, I don't know if you use those words, isotopomics, or, So, see, you give me a new tool and I'll misuse it. So anyways, this is a great slide, and I would say that was very prescient of you to pull that out. And, you've mapped out your entire career here, right? Or, maybe many people's careers. So I think that's important. And I think there's the same spin-off here of the tools that are developed for humans, we're going to make use of them, right? And I guess this is some tray where you're doing God knows 100 samples at a time, right?
Yeah, it's 4 months, yeah.
Yeah. So, and next year you'll come back and this will be 1,000, and on and on. Okay. So now we're making a transition to the captive animals, and what we learned when we can actually get our hands on a live marine mammal. And so the thing that Dorian talked about was the auditory evoked potential, and the technical development that he and Jim Prenderin have made in terms of making this sort of portable, and you can be a non-expert and still push the button and get a reasonable answer. And it really will open it up to where we'll get hearing tests on all these species that we don't know much about. We'll get many animals, so we're not dependent on just the one deaf animal that happened to be in captivity. I mean, there actually is a horror story like that. The first orca that they ever tested its hearing, was essentially deaf. I think that's true, and it lasted that way for some time. Yeah. And so it took a while to figure that out. So anyways, this is great, and we'll revolutionize that business. Now, going into the field work, and now this is Greg Shore telling us about the improved tags and improved tag availability, basically based on miniaturizing the electronics and learning how to do an attachment that lasts quite some time but isn't quite so invasive as some of the other, the deeply implanted attachments. So you learn about migration routes, stock structure, and then start to look at, overlap with things like sound and other anthropogenic threats. So I think this is going to really change a lot of the way we do things. I mean, I'm not sure that even, Cascadia or whoever has come to grips with yet all the things that can be done with this. So, and in fact, Daniel Palacios, there you are, your poster yesterday, right? You have some of Bruce's data, and then looking at habitat from this kind of thing. So it's really, I think, going to change the way we think about, our field studies. So, and then, we didn't have Brandon, but Greg Shore did a great job of telling us about SoCal 10, and this is this really large, collaborative, interdisciplinary work trying to go out and tease out the response of animals to sonar-like signals. And one of the impressive things was just the scale of the tagging, numbers of species and hours of tag data. And, we could probably not do this as a 5-year project, but as a 1-year project, and spend the next 4 years just analyzing this. I mean, I don't want to do that, but there's a lot of stuff here. And so 28 controlled exposure is really impressive. And so I think that says we've really come a long way in being able to do this kind of experiment. And I think, there are other settings, other questions that you could think about doing the same kind of thing. So, but there'll be a lot of sort of fallout of things that we didn't expect to learn that we will, just having from this quantity of tag data. So, so here's kind of a summary of the talks. Is that we have our omics that we've made a lot of advancement in because we can process a lot of samples. The same thing with the biochemical assays. The evoke potential is one example of things we can do with captive animals. There are probably some others that will come out. In the improved tagging and the field methods are going to be important for us learning about migration and habitat. And then this is from my talk before. I left it up there, of course, but we didn't really talk about it today, but autonomous vehicles and acoustic recorders. So, okay, so now we get into the discussion. And to sort of open up the discussion, I thought about these 4 sort of steps in terms of new technology working its way into the being used and answering questions. And one is that there just needs to be some way of disseminating information as the new technology becomes available. How is it that you know? And if you wait to just read the literature, you're probably 5 years behind. And so this one you can kind of say, well, this is what we're doing today, but there may be more that we need to do to help people understand kind of what's out there. And I found the talks here useful, but we have to think about how are we going to, to the whole community, get out the word on sort of what's possible. And then once you've figured out, okay, this thing's out there, you have to say, here's my question. I want to know this. And can this new technology help me answer this question, and how? Is it a more efficient way of doing something than what I'm doing now? And then if you get past this and say, yeah, it really would be helpful, then there's the issue of the access. Because the new technology, often somebody's put a lot of time into developing it, and it's their, precious little thing, and, do you collaborate, or is there some way of transferring the technology? So this is there's a little bit of a block here. And one of the aspects of this is providing support and recognition to the people who work just sort of developing the technology. And this was brought up for Jim Finnerman, who's worked so hard on the auditory evoke potential. We want to encourage people who develop technology to keep doing that and to get credit and support for having done it. So that's part of this access bit. So I don't really know. We didn't actually solve this problem other than I'll show you a recommendation that has to do with just partly once people know and think about it, then there has to be some mechanism to form these collaborations, or at least transfer the technology. So there are just a couple of recommendations, and I'm going to give these, and then I'm going to back up a little bit to give more of a richness of the discussion. But I was surprised how much of our time we spent talking about facilitating collaboration, and it makes sense in the new technology context. It really makes sense because there are people who need technology, and there are people who have technology, and you want to put them together or somehow transfer the information. Dave Weller was sitting in the front row, and as we got into this discussion, said, well, we already kind of did this, we already did, but, you know, there you are. So, you know, so I'm kind of backing up what Bernardo said about, you know, we need some kind of way of knowing who is doing what in SoCal, right? That's just sort of the baseline of what are we doing now. But part of that are the technologies that are being applied, right? And so you know who it is that may have a technology that would be useful to you. But the other aspect of that is that if we want to really collaborate, there needs to be some sort of meshing of the terminology and the methodology, I guess, you know, that it's consistent, right? Otherwise, it may end up that, you know, you were working with apples and I was working with oranges, and we can't really do the comparison. So, and then there was a discussion of, well, gee, you know, there are other people working on the same thing in, you know, other places, but we're, at least I said this, and so I get to go on the slide, I thought it's better to keep it regional, because, you know, you can't solve the whole world's problems, and so let's you know, get our own house in order first. And so, you know, because that is what we all have in common. We work on the same animals and in the same, you know, piece of ocean. So, so as well as just having this database of kind of who's doing what and, you know, what are their cool gadgets, if we make first the metadata and then potentially the data available, then that's going to help as well. And, you know, and how do you support this? So I was kind of surprised. We actually spent a lot of time in the technology thing talking about data sharing. And given that I missed the data sharing before, you know, that's where, you know, Dave was saying, well, you already done this. So, okay, so let me just give a flavor a second for, because I feel bad about, you know, we had quite a bit of discussion. And so in the genomics, or in the genetics theme, genomics theme, there was a question about borrowing from human genomic techniques. Well, and also, you know, once we have this large-scale application of method, what are we going to learn from that? And one thing that Phil said was that for some questions, like defining subspecies, we will get much more quantitative than we are now, just because we're forced to, because we have these huge databases. And so that's something that will probably come about, is that our whole concept of, you know, what's a species or subspecies. I think maybe Barb said something like that, or I was in the back of the room, so I didn't hear everything you said. And then let's see, there was also, oh yeah, Phil's comment about we're all going to be, you know, computer geeks if we're not careful. And then Matthew mentioned the concept of, gee, you know, this is a forest in the trees kind of thing. If you study the bark of the trees too much, aren't you missing, you know, the structure of the whole forest? And I don't know where did Matthew? There you go. Right. And so I think that is an important concept, that, and maybe the key thing there is not just developing cool tools for their own sake, but trying to fit them into a larger picture. But I do see that can be a concern, that if you just get your head, you know, buried in the computer and you're not actually thinking about the animals, that you could get in trouble. So I think that's a valid comment. Let's see, there were comments about standardizing our data collection, you know, so that helps them with the collaboration. Oh yeah, and then Mark Spalding talked about really how we have to make more of an effort of communicating with the public, and this actually ties into our funding as well. And then Sarah brought up a really important point, that something we missed, and that is the marine observatories that are coming up. Where'd you go, Sarah? Anyway, that it's something that, you know, there are these efforts now, and our local effort is called SCOOS, where they're monitoring the ocean, trying to provide real-time feedback to various agencies. And so there's a bunch of data there that we might not have tapped into as much as we should have, and so that probably should have been something that we present here. So come back the next time and we'll talk about the observatories, because I think that is a good tie-in. So anyway, that's pretty much what we did.
Remarkable discussion during the vessel collision workshop this morning. And before I get into it, I just wanted to read through the goals that we had set up yesterday for this ambitious setting. The first goal we had was to identify future research that needs to be conducted in Southern California and in the U.S. West Coast to improve the risk analysis that Jessica Redfern and Megan McKenna talked about today, and to discuss future research, and that discussion should span the range from data collection to analysis methodology. And we also wanted to discuss mitigation strategies with the highest probability of success for as many stakeholders as possible. And I'm happy to report that I think we did achieve those goals this morning. So well done to the panel and to the audience. We had 4 extremely informative presentations this morning by Jay Barlow, Megan McKenna, Jessica Redfern, and John Callan-Vakitas. I don't want to go through what each of them did because it is quite remarkable, but I think what I would like to say on what they discussed this morning is that it really highlighted where we are, where we've come from, and the discussion provided some concrete next steps. So the panel, I think we had the largest panel. We had 9 people, and we did a fairly good job of keeping things moving and communicating with one another. And we began by discussing the mitigation strategies that I posed to the larger group yesterday about location and speed. And what came out of those discussions, I thought, really highlighted something that's very unique to the scientific community as a whole. And it's really to encourage all of us to continue having the right discussions with the right people. Because one of the things that came out of, well, not one of the things, but one of the many things that came out of the discussion that I noticed was having folks that are working on research, talking with folks that are doing management things and things like that, and how, it really highlighted how important it is to have that right conversation and have someone there to answer that question that you might have regarding a particular management strategy that you think might work for the animals that you're working on. So I implore all of us to continue to have those conversations with the right people and encourage all of us to continue to do that. There was a considerable discussion on the port access route study that the U.S. Coast Guard is conducting. And that's kind of what I'm hinting to encourage these conversations. I think a lot of the researchers in the room learned a lot about that process and learned a lot about the limitations and what we can and can't do and what they can and can't do. It certainly was a learning opportunity for me, and I believe it was for everybody else as well. How do changing the routes work? How long does it take to make a change? And if you are able to make a change, how compliant are folks with that change? So there's a lot of information about that. And then that ended up leading into a lot of the research that folks have been working on that they talked about and what future things can we go on. So it was, again, helpful to hear what we can and can't do, and helpful to hear from particularly Greg Silber on the efforts that they've made on the East Coast with right whales and how things are potentially similar here, potentially not so similar here. Things for folks to keep in mind. And again, it highlights having those right discussions with the right people. And again, thank you to the folks here for permitting us to have a venue to have these discussions, to do that. And so what I'd like to discuss a little bit is basically the work that was conducted on the risk model that was described by Jessica Redfern and her contributors. And again, it's preliminary work, but I think it really is a good launching pad for all of us to move forward, to continue the work that is already going on, and to perhaps redirect a little bit of the focus on what to do next. And it was really interesting to hear from our panelists on what they've done in their particular interests. And I think I saw a couple light bulbs go on as to how perhaps they can redirect some of what they're already doing in collaborations with others to further this effort to get some more information. And we came up with about, well, I wrote down about 5 or 6 priorities, and they're not listed in ranking of priority, but rather how we got to the discussion point. So one of the first things that we talked about was doing a parallel effort to what is already going on right now with this preliminary model that folks are already working on, and actually having something with a non-systematic sampling effort, not something that's a ship line transect survey or an aerial survey like that, but more finer scale, getting into finer scale questions, and really thinking about how fine of a scale do we really want to do, and how informative that fine scale will get to what we really need to get for an answer. The other thing that came about is that we really need to know a little bit more about what the whales are doing, day versus night. One of the things that popped up is that there's some differences between day and night behavior, and in fact there's a lot more ships traveling at night, so there might be something going on there. There was a lot of encouragement to continue the current work that folks are doing, and a lot of side discussions post our panel to figure out ways to facilitate continuing the work, and to keep that in mind. There's also a suggestion to prioritize the work by species. And there were some suggestions on how to do that. John came up with a nice back-of-the-envelope idea on how to do it. And I can defer to him to discuss that if he likes in a moment. But one thing that stemmed out of that Barb brought up is that it would be really useful to estimate what exactly one animal coming in confirmed ship strike means as far as the number of deaths as a whole. Because as we know, it's a very minimum number that we get. We're not seeing the whole picture. And something that we had as a little side discussion post that comment was that, you know, if we have a year where there's a lot of animals that are being hit, it probably is reflective that there's probably something more going on. But when you've got, so that we could probably get a range. And so what came out of that is that that question certainly needs a little bit more thought and a little bit more discussion amongst the group on how to move forward with that, but certainly something that is worth looking into. And the other thing that we came up with that was very interesting and kind of ties into what Barb said at the beginning of her talk today about certainty, deal with it, and uncertainty, deal with it, is that we heard from industry, we had a representative from industry saying that, you know, if you guys just tell us what to do, you know, and give us some certainty with it, then, you know, we can follow along and do it. But there's a lot of uncertainty in the whales, and there's also actually a lot of uncertainty in ship behavior. And so I think we need to come to an agreement as to how much we can accept amongst the two groups working together in order to come up with something. And that's kind of where we ended up. We certainly didn't intend to come up with any solution. We wanted to just keep going on moving forward with this question and working through these components. And I think we got a lot of good feedback from one another on how to move forward and the steps that we need to take to continue this effort. And I was really, really proud of the panelists and the contributions from the audience members on how far we actually got in just a short amount of time within the hour of this discussion on such a complex issue. So I'd like to open it up to my panel members first to see if they have anything that they would like to contribute. That's pretty much all I have. Wow. Nobody has anything to say? Jay.
Well, I think that it was brought up that there's probably no optimum solution for all species of whales. That some changes in ship movement would affect some species less and other species more, and so that there will ultimately have to be some trade-offs with regard to what species are most important to protect.
Yeah, and there was a very interesting comment that when the question came about is, well, what do we have to do to protect whales? That's kind of a loaded question. You know, it's almost like, well, what do we have to do to protect this particular species as opposed to this particular species? Because when you start lumping them all together, there's a lot of different factors that come into play. And one of the things that was highlighted from the model that came out was that, you know, quite frankly, no matter what we do, there are going to be really bad years where there's going to be more animals that are going to be hit, and there's going to be years where there aren't going to be as many animals hit. Liz?
I would add something. I think the session ended up when we had industry representatives there talking about what the shipping industry would and wouldn't do and the case that we need to make to have them change their behavior. So in addition to having, talking about all these collaborations and having scientists talk to regulators, but I think also talking to industry and understanding the perspective of the people that are being regulated, that are being affected, and the science that is being used to change, to regulate their behaviors. It's really important they know those things. And so I think that was one of the real values of our session, was really getting the scientists and the regulators and the industry talking to one another. So to me, it seems collaboration is such a theme of this workshop that I thought the end of the workshop session particularly really brought that home.
John.
I thought one sort of interesting thing just about the dynamics of our discussion were that I think we were probably 3/4 of the way through our entire period when maybe it was probably very apparent to the audience, but it wasn't apparent to me to that point, that we had yet to take audience questions because the panelists were all too eager to ask each other questions.
Yes.
And I think we would have done that for the entire time. It was like, there are a bunch of people out there raising their hands. Give them a chance. I think there was an excitement in some of the interactions and chance for the people that were up there to talk to each other, because that has been rare, and it was exciting for me to have, Marine Exchange, industry rep, Coast Guard, people that are there, and you're actually, instead of talking about them as if there's some other entity, you can actually ask them, how would, that entity or the industry feel about this kind of thing? What is practical and what isn't? And that was just, it's kind of amazing. We really haven't, in my experience, I haven't quite had that chance. So here.
Yeah, and it was exciting to watch. It really was, just to see that generate and how it went forward. So, yeah, I commend everybody in the panel and the audience members for being patient.
At some point they would go, though.
Yeah.
I have a question about the session, because your session, it seems to me, I wasn't in it, was defined had limits to what the subject was in such a way that it seemed like it could be very directed. Did it feel different from the other session that you attended? Because it sounds different than kind of these open-ended, how do we all collaborate, or what new technologies and where can the sky's the limit kind of thing go? So did you find that the session had a different feel to it and was particularly useful in the workshop?
It was certainly useful for me and what I have to do on a daily basis, because it's actually, it's just right after Jessica and I were standing there and we're planning on writing something up right off the bat to continue to facilitate more work on this, so that the motivation doesn't drop, and to continue to encourage the researchers to keep moving on what they're doing and really to continue the work. So personally, I thought it was extremely beneficial, but I'm also biased because it helps me on a day-to-day life. So I don't know if other panelists have anything more to say on that. But
I think it's a really interesting point that you're bringing up. Ours really was a very focused group with really concrete, specific goals, and I think we achieved those goals. We got some really exciting ideas for how to move forward. But the panelists keep emphasizing we had stakeholders in the room that we don't usually get to talk to, and that was wonderful. So I think it might have been a little bit different of a session here of the other ones, but I think it was powerful, and I'm glad we had the opportunity to do that. So I think that's good news.
Can we hear from some of the stakeholders? How they felt about it?
I know 2 of them left.
There you go.
I don't know if anybody else. Well, Mike's here. I don't know if you want to talk. Probably not. He got bombarded with parse questions, but so informative for those of us that aren't familiar with it.
I don't have too much to add. I agree with everything you're saying. It was a good opportunity to meet the other panelists. I don't get to meet, interact with that often. It's valuable to have that exchange of information and ideas.
Great. No other questions? Thank you.
The format for this short piece I'm going to do is to share well, first I think I'll review the reviews of... you think I'm joking. I am going to go through and pick a couple of highlights for me and points to make, but part of my time up here is to get a little bit of participation from you guys on what you found beneficial. So I plan to do a couple of polls and show of hands, but I'm also going to ask you in about 10 minutes to think about, and a few of you volunteer to share either a key insight that you got in the last 2 days, something you learned, a new contact or potential collaborator, or maybe even a collaboration that you started or furthered here. And I'll be asking how many people had those kinds of experiences, but I'd also like a few of you to volunteer if you've had those, because I know as I stop and reflect for a second about it, there are a number of them that I can think of that have happened to me. So if you can be thinking about that just as I talk, and we'll come back to that point. I want to start with, and I'll come back to just Bob's opening remarks at the beginning, which I kind of reflect on. He put out the Pacific Life Ask Questions, and kind of looks to groups like us for answers. And a couple of things I can reflect on that. First of all, I found that now, I think in attending things like this in Pacific Life, organizing them and having them, I think you're selling yourself short. I think this has probably become one of the best summaries of what's going on in the region, and I've actually found Bob and Tennyson some of the best informed people I know of. And also I can reflect on the fact when he says he likes to ask questions. I can also say that I think I've never had as tough questions from anybody else in projects as I have from them. So they do ask questions, and they ask tough questions, and they ask questions that I think often come from maybe a little different place than we tend to ask questions of each other as scientists, and I think that's incredibly valuable. But as you sort of reflected, and I'm addressing this to Bob now because you were sort of saying, and when I first met Bob 6-7 years ago at the start of the Splash project, he was sort of explaining to me then that how he didn't view he was really qualified to review research or proposal, and that's why at that time he was relying on organizations like the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. That at Splash we got into an odd arrangement where we were getting funding from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that had come from Pacific Life. But NIFWF required us to come up with a match. And Pacific Life agreed to match. So it was quite a helpful arrangement. But more than that, I heard you again yesterday sort of say now you rely on the Marine Mammal Commission for review of proposals. And but I kind of reflect across that 6 years that I do think you guys should not sell short your expertise and knowledge in reviewing, and especially having set 2 of these up, which I think represent some of the best progress forward in promoting collaboration and sharing that has occurred. That you guys have done an amazing job that way. We'll come back to that, but I just wanted to kind of start there. I also want to just talk just for a second, because we've had reviews of these different topic areas, and I wanted to just mention a little bit about the keynote and the 2 speakers we had, that Barb today and Tom White. And I think I gained a number of things. It does seem like there are a number of new terms. I'm going to come back to John H's stealing a new term, but certainly we learned a new one from Tom White, which was non-human persons. And while that became almost a punchline of a number of things that evening afterward, it actually was, I thought, an extremely insightful question. And having been on the phone when we discussed kind of the choice of that, it was an unconventional choice. And I was curious how it would turn out. And while opinions may vary, I thought it was fantastic. In that it got us to talk in a different area. he didn't seem like he was trying to sell his book, but he actually did a talk that I thought was extremely effective because he didn't really cover what was in his book. He kind of set us up for that. So you really felt compelled to ask, so what's in that book anyway? Which is exactly what an author should be trying to do, right? You want to know, so now I got to go find out what a non-human person is. But he did summarize a little bit at the end, and I thought that was just a great talk. And I was quite moved to Barb. That was, you know, I could feel your passion about what you were talking about, and I thought the three examples, false killer whales, Baji, and Vaquita, all have these incredible lessons. Some of them positive, one of them negative, one of them looking hopeful. But I think it was very good to reflect what had gotten us there. You know, working as a team, piggybacking research and people bootlegging research to learn things and staying passionate to a certain cause, dealing with uncertainty and fighting off negativity. I mean, those were all key lessons that as we looked at the threats that Anne was putting up there and we think about them and want to feel overwhelmed, you know, those were important remarks that, you know, that meant, you know, meant a lot to think about how we can deal with these challenges we're dealing with right now. Okay, I am not going to completely review the panels, but I do. I wrote a couple of things down, like for example, the environmental threats panel. I do have one quote from that I think just stuck with me. Nothing like pus in the morning. Thanks to Judy, wherever she is for that. I think I debated whether to try the prioritization scheme that Jay was suggesting, and maybe I'll give it just a quick try. So we have risk as the multiplication of potential for occurrence, how likely it is, times the consequence. So if we can all be thinking that of as risk. And if we break down, it's a slightly varied list, but if we take, I'm going to give you a preview, and then I'm going to ask, I'm going to just see if you can pick one. And I'm going to just do a little tally. I'm just curious where that comes out. We have contaminants, we have oil spill, we have climate change, we have ship strike, we have underwater, ship sound, Navy sonar. I decided to split those out. Incidental fishing mortality, biotoxin, prey fishery competition. And I think there are a few I left out, not as anthropogenic, but that's my list. Think for a second. You're going to pick one.
No, let's pick two.
Let us pick two. You just can't go with it. I can't go with this. I can go with this. You're going to pick no more than two. And we're just going to do show of hands. I'm just going to do a rough estimate. Okay. Contaminants.
This is highest risk.
Highest risk. Your top two. Okay. Oil spill. Okay. Environmental climate change. By the way, that's not an actual count. But ship strike. Underwater ship sound. Navy sonar. Incidental fishing mortality. Biotoxins. Prey fishery competitions. Okay. Wow, that was interesting. I would not have predicted that at all. The number one winner, incidental fishery mortality, wins at an approximate count of 30. Environmental climate change comes in second at about 20. Third would be ship strike. And then we have 4 that are close to tied: contaminants, underwater ship sound, biotoxin, prey fishery competition, all came in at 5 to 7. And Navy sonar and oil spill are the 2 in the bottom category. So you can almost come up with, so you can group it in a couple of ways, but group it in about 3 bins or so. And it's interesting, it's more defined than I thought it would be, so what do you know, we can prioritize. By the vote mechanism, this is taking it from the biological review team. And it's science, it's quantified too. It must be real.
Put it on the internet.
Yeah. Gee, we can all go home now. Okay. I think one thing I got from John's tools and toys, which is good, which I think yesterday he pointed out we know less than the public often thinks we do, but at the same time, we're now getting tools that maybe will get us up to their expectation. We might actually reach there. And we learned about omics. I was trying to think of, so with all the information, omics. So maybe this workshop can be SoCalomics. And we just went through a threadomics. Anyway, you can go anywhere with that. We talked a little bit on the ship strike part, and I kind of said what was my exciting part of that, so I think that's great. Now, I'm saving the last sort of panel because one thing that's kind of interested me, all the talk we've had on collaboration, from Dave Weller starting with defining collaboration, and I especially like the conspire and unite part of it, but the many ways that you can define that. And there are a few thoughts about that. First of all, at breakfast yesterday morning, John H. said, these are the most important 15 minutes of the entire conference, which I think he wasn't necessarily referring to the food, but these informal moments outside of the conference, where you get a chance to talk and chat, and I think that's kind of the key part. Clearly, a key goal we've been here to do is to promote awareness, to share, to meet, and really, the one part I sort of thought was missing from all our discussion about collaboration was a failure to realize that that's exactly what we're doing right now. That we talk about collaboration, and all the talk of collaboration always seemed to almost be like we were talking about it as some other thing we were going to do after this meeting, or we're going to come up with a plan of how to collaborate. And the part that I want to drive home is to collaborate, you need to know what other people are doing. That's what we were doing here the last 2 days. You need to establish a relationship with them, and I saw a lot of that occurring. You need to meet and plan, and I saw a lot of that occurring here as well. So as we talk about collaboration, don't fail to give credit to the fact that this was collaboration right here. This was a key part of it. And that's where it takes me to my a couple of questions I wanted to ask here with another show of hands. Raise your hand if you feel you learned of a research project that you didn't know about here. Wow. That is like just about everybody in the room. And if you had asked me, did I know about most of the research going on in the Southern California Bight before this meeting, I probably would have been arrogant and said, yeah, I think I do. And maybe some of you were coming into this new, but many of you have been doing this for years like I have, and probably thought you did too. And it was still, lo and behold, there were new things going on. I had no idea, and I got to talk to people and learn new things. So that, huge step for me. Who actually met and talked about a collaboration with somebody, planned something they would be doing together, and they met and did that here? Pretty good, about half the room, so actually furthered a collaboration. Who actually got down to some nitty-gritty sharing, like, handed off some disks of data or did something like that, where we actually did something along those lines? I know. been diligently thinking about, and with these polls, I've hopefully prompted you to think about it. I guess I'd like to ask you to, anyone who would, if we can just kind of look for a show of hands, if you'd like to just mention a key insight or something new you learned about that was particularly valuable about this conference.
Tomcat, that came as news to me.
Password, the secret password revealed.
I wouldn't say it's so much something new, but it was, I think, an important reminder, as others have said, how helpful it is to have representatives from industry or government and all in the same place talking, coming up with strategies. It's very useful.
When I showed up yesterday, I expected I was going to know most of the people here, and I was surprised I didn't know about 80% of the people. And I found out that, delightfully, many of the people here are students who are coming up. And it's nice when we talk about collaborative efforts, it's not just PIs talking with one another. I was talking to one of the students last night about giving the students the opportunity to know these people and think about collaborations well in advance of their time of being PIs themselves.
I want to explain why I wanted to vote twice.
Yes.
I don't know. Because, I mean, in deference to what Jay said, I mean, Jay set a pretty high bar to say this thing's got to take out half the population in so many years. And so, but because I think, one of the worries is that these animals are being subjected to multiple threats, and we don't really know. And there can be these cumulative or synergistic effects. I mean, it's only when you've got, these three things that hit you that it really takes you down. So that's why I thought it was more appropriate instead of just saying, here's the one. I mean, I actually would have liked to have voted 5 or 6 times. For all of them! but just to keep that in mind, that I think there's that potential for the fact that it's such an urban area, there's so many things going on, because they've got, the ships and the sound and the toxics and, the climate change, everything. So you have to worry that cumulative effect is really, quite negative.
Right. Steve?
Yeah, I was struck, I mean, we were just commenting back here, that, we had a session on ship strikes, and we had a session on toxics and disease and human impacts. We had a section on technology. And yet the threats associated with those things didn't rank as high as 2 things, climate and fishing impacts, for which we didn't have a session. And I'm curious if, it makes me wonder if people's perceptions of those other threats were reduced because we had sessions on them and talked about what's going on, and didn't have a detailed discussion of the other things, or whether that would have been their impression yesterday morning.
Right. I mean, what's sort of interesting about those two is that when we talked about the 2 elements of risk, which are likelihood and consequence, basically, I think those 2 represent sort of the opposite end of that spectrum. One we know occurs with a high probability, but we have somewhat of a measured amount of risk. It's what goes into the whole calculation of things above PBR or observers. And the other represents the thing that has a great deal of uncertainty, but a big consequence. It was interesting to me that those 2 from the opposite ends of that risk equation rose to the top. But I think it might be a good suggestion for the next conference 2 years ago to look at what came out high and got missed, and maybe hit it and see if that changes things.
Actually, climate change was part of the environmental.
Right.
But it wasn't a focused session.
Yeah, it was, but it covered all the other ones too. So it was kind of a big, whether to focus on that. Other particular, anything else someone can share on an interesting contact you made, a thing you learned?
It's not exactly that, but I felt sort of torn. I mean, I would like to have cloned myself so I could be in both rooms. I felt like I missed half the conference, and I really would have, everything that happened here, I would have liked to have heard. So So I don't know if that means that we need to have less or make it longer, or or get Phil working on cloning me or something.
John, you get to go home tomorrow and watch the videotape.
YouTube. Okay.